Brand new designs are up on the Edge Redbubble, werewolves, spiders, FedEx amphibians, proto-crocs, and more. Go check out the Redbubble with links in the description and comments section below. Cloning. It's the way of the future, right? It's the single piece of miracle technology that will allow us to bring back any animals we caused to go extinct. It's the one-way ticket to worlds of the past. We can use it to recreate the dinosaurs just because we can. We could even use it to create our own chimeric abominations to resemble the myths of old. Well, no, none of that science fiction nonsense. Cloning is easily one of the most widely misunderstood pieces of scientific technology. It's not a computer program of DNA information where you can simply nip and tuck the code and then print it out onto an egg and sperm to create your desired life form. Nor is it truly a way to bring back the dead. It's way more complicated than any of that. Cloning is the process of copying the genetic information of one organism to create another identical organism. This occurs in nature as well as in our labs. In nature, some critters can produce clones through asexual reproduction. They don't need a partner to make more of themselves. Some living things, like bacteria, simply split apart, while others, like plants, chop off a bit of themselves, which grows into a whole new but identical organism. Plants can also shoot out a root of themselves, which moves for a short distance underground, before erupting as a new extension of itself, though I don't think that really falls under the definition of cloning. There are now many different types of cloning, but since everyone thinks of cloning whole animals, let's explain that type. This type of cloning, the type that artificially clones a whole organism, is called reproductive cloning. Boiled down to its finest elements, the process is essentially taking out the nucleus from one cell and putting a new one in from the cell of a different individual animal. If nothing goes wrong there, then the cell is transferred to the uterus of a surrogate mother. By the way, the nucleus is essentially the brain or bank of the cell. It holds all of the cell's genome and organizes all that DNA. It's the boss that tells everything else in the cell what to do. Thanks to countless simplifications, exaggerations, and abstractions of the processes involved with cloning in the movies, the public has a very skewed perception of cloning. Allow me, with the help of the literature, to blow away some of the many misconceptions around this technique. Myth: cloning is new. Every single time cloning comes up in the news or in movies, it seems to be presented as this novel technology, with its full potential only being realized now. This is far from the truth. The process of cloning is relatively old. We eat fruits and veggies from plants that have been grafted from others, making them identical clones. Horticulture has been using cloned plants since its inception, and humans have been interacting with this process all the way back to the origin of agriculture. That may be a disappointing answer though, since we're talking about the sci-fi concept of copying a multicellular organism. But that's also relatively old. Artificial, non-agricultural cloning first began in 1924 when German embryologist Hans Spemann and his student Hilde Mangold were the first to perform somatic cell nuclear transfer, a type of cellular cloning. Off topic, but Hilde Mangold is the real hero of the story, as it was her 1923 dissertation that was used as the basis for the experiments that Spemann gets all the credit for. You wouldn't guess why. Anyway, the Spemann guy won a Nobel Prize for the work in the 1930s, and then they began cloning frogs in the 1950s. Cloning mammals is a lot trickier and newer. The first mammal clones were born in the 1990s, and of course, Dolly the sheep was the first successful animal cloned from a cell from an adult animal. She was born in 1996. Myth: clones are a specific animal's DNA grafted onto another body. Yeah, this one is just flat out incorrect. Contrary to sci-fi books and movies, clones are born just like any other animal. The difference here is that the clone didn't require a sperm to enter an egg to be conceived. Clone embryos are made by putting in a nucleus or cell from a donor animal into another cell. That embryo is then put in a surrogate uterus and allowed to grow to term as normal. It's kinda like in vitro fertilization, but without the fertilization part. Myth: offspring of clones are clones, and each generation gets weaker and has more and more problems. This one is a total misconception. A clone produces offspring in the same way as its parent could, and no problems occur. A clone doesn't all of a sudden reproduce asexually just because it was produced that way. Myth: clones are always identical in looks. As hard as it is to believe, what with all the identical DNA thing, clones don't always look identical. They may have slight variations in coat color or markings. Let's take identical twins for an example. See these two identical twin calves? They have the same genes but look slightly different in some ways. This has nothing to do with the genes themselves and everything to do with how they are expressed, how the information in the gene is represented in a living animal. This even happens in identical twin humans. In livestock, this occurs due to expression of coat color, spots, stripes, and so on. The same thing happens to clones. Myth: clones have exactly the same temperament and personality as the animals from which they are cloned. This one goes along with the last myth, but it's even more variable. It's at least possible that clones may express their genes identically, but it's impossible for them to express the same temperament or personality. This is because personality is determined only partially by genetics. The rest is built by the individual over their life due to lived experiences. Plus, there may be some special ingredient in there we don't yet understand, too. This is why the sci-fi concept of cloning people to extend a lifespan has always been total fantasy. Even if a cloned person was put through the exact same experiences as their DNA donor, there's still a chance they'd end up slightly different. Plus, memory cannot be cloned, so the original copy dies when they die. Myth: when clones are born, they're the same age as their donors and don't live long. All clones are born the same way as their DNA donor and other organisms. They are grown from a cell and are born as babies. They have to live through their natural lifespan to reach the age of their donor. That is, until we are able to create some sort of artificial womb or tank to keep the organism in until they reach the age of their donor. That's like high concept sci-fi we aren't even close to having yet. A study done on the genetics and aging of Dolly the sheep found that her telomeres, part of the chromosome that has connections to aging, were shorter than her older donor. Telomeres are their longest when animals are born, and shorten as the animal ages, thus the whole connection to aging. Dolly was much younger than her donor, but her telomeres were shorter. Further studies on other clones found that telomeres were shorter in only some parts of the body, where telomeres in other parts of the body were as long as they should be for the age of the individual. So, despite the reports of short telomeres, clones still age relatively normally. Make sure you've subscribed to see more natural history content like this. Hit the bell icon to keep yourself in the loop, and leave a comment if you feel like it. Myth: cloning results in severely damaged animals that suffer and continue to have health problems all their lives. This one is false, and based only loosely on some minor issues observed in early cloning. The vast majority of swine and goat clones are actually born healthy, grow normally, and are as susceptible to genetic abnormalities as their donors and any other animal. At the beginning of the use of assisted reproductive technologies to, assist embryos in the cloning process, veterinarians noticed something strange. Some calf and lamb fetuses were growing too large during pregnancy, with some serious birth defects. These were given the name large offspring abnormalities. They've been seen in cow and sheep clones, but nothing else. They seem to appear more often in clones than they do in non-clones, which is what led to news outlets picking it up as evidence that cloning is ultimately flawed. The syndrome is probably related to stuff that happens outside the body during pregnancy, rather than stuff occurring to the DNA from cloning. As people who used the assisted reproductive technologies learned more about the tech and the processes involved with the tech, the rate of syndrome appearance in clones decreased. Myth: cow clones make human pharmaceuticals in their milk. This one is another misconception stoked by the media and confusing words. Scientists have been able to genetically engineer cows to produce human pharmaceuticals in their milk. It is not because these animals are clones, as being a clone has nothing to do with randomly producing something new. These animals were genetically modified. They had new genetic information inserted into their genome. Myth: when a chicken clone lays eggs, the chicks that hatch are clones. Turns out birds have never been cloned before, so this one starts on a false premise. Once we are able to clone birds, the chicks hatched from the eggs wouldn't be clones, as they would have the genetic material of their father. Myth: meat from clones is already in the food supply. Short answer, yes. Long answer is that the meat and milk from cloned animals or offspring of cloned animals is identical to that of non-cloned animals, and of course the donor animal. Meat from these cloned animals hasn't been introduced in any high quantities to the public, as these cloned animals are largely used in breeding programs. Myth: cloning can cure diseases in livestock. No, untrue. Cloning cannot directly cure anything. If the donor animal had a developmental disorder or any other kind of congenital disease, then any clone would have it too. However, if you had a perfectly healthy animal that contracted something later in life that killed or incapacitated it, you could clone it to get a similarly healthy animal without the disease, and then just try to keep the clone away from the vector that affected the donor. Cloning would also be used to replicate disease-resistant animals to breed with non-clones to help produce lines that are continuously more disease-resistant. Myth: scientists can bring back extinct species by cloning them. This one isn't so much a myth as it is out of our reach. It is theoretically possible and has been tried with animals which have recently gone extinct, but none have been entirely successful. The idea of de-extinction for animals that humans may have played a part in causing to go extinct seems like a good idea, but it comes with a lot of strings. Mammoths are one of the top subjects for de-extinction, as they were a major component for keeping global CO2 levels down by stomping it into the permafrost. But they died out long ago enough that any preserved DNA would be extremely damaged to a level that you'd never be able to recreate the woolly mammoth as it was when it was alive. Instead, genetic material from close relatives would need to be mixed with any material gathered from mummified mammoth remains. Even then, it would be a huge stretch that would take a lot of time and money and result in what is essentially a hairy elephant. Is that really worth it when there are lots of animals alive today that need help? I don't know for sure. I do know for sure that it's impossible to bring the dinosaurs back to life. Anything preserved in amber has been trapped in there so long that it is essentially dust with the minutest of minute pieces of extraordinarily degraded genetic material. Some research has been done on extremely well-preserved dinosaur fossils that have preserved cells. These cells are basically just rusty blood cells and don't have anything resembling DNA that would be useful for recreating a genome. Any news article suggesting otherwise doesn't understand the situation. Though we could genetically engineer an animal to look somewhat like a non-avian dinosaur. Modern avian dinosaurs, the birds, have a lot of genes that are turned off. Old, crusty genetic material left over from their non-avian dinosaurian ancestors remains in their DNA. Theoretically, with the right technique and technology, one might be able to turn on the old DNA and hatch a bird with a tail, clawed digits, and a fleshy, toothed snout. This is also quite a ways off from successfully creating a dinosaur-like bird, and wouldn't exactly give the world anything it needed, so I don't think it's something worth pursuing. That was a short list of some of the commonest myths and misconceptions on cloning. It's no longer new and scary, and Crichton is no longer around to fearmonger about its utilization. We aren't going to be overrun with bioterrorism, chimeric monsters, or prehistoric beasts anytime soon, but we can definitely get you an identical copy of your dog or cow. There are probably a ton more myths and misconceptions, so another video may be forthcoming. For more interesting stories about nature, the history of life, or what goes bump in the night, subscribe, hit the bell icon for updates, like this video, and drop a comment in the comment section below. Thanks for watching. Special thanks goes to my elephant tier patrons, Thea Svensson, Staniforth Hopkins, Dinosaur, Chris Frampton, Biotaverse, Arda Bayer, and Christoph Hubbinger, as well as my Tyrannosaur patrons, Iron Bladesman, Henry Brennan, Danny Van Heck, and Dana Manchester.